So when you're talking about battery cages, and you're talking about, what are they're laying hens that are in the battery cages, correct?
Right.
Okay. When you're talking about the space that they have to live, okay, I brought this piece of paper for you. Can you explain to me about how much room these animals have in comparison to this piece of paper?
Sure, Brandy. The fact of the matter is that more than 9 out of 10 egg cartons that you would see in a supermarket come from birds who are locked inside of cages so cramped they're unable even to spread their wings. These birds have so little space that while there are no mandatory rules for how many square inches they have to each be given, the egg industry has its own voluntary guidelines that egg producers can choose to comply with or not. Most people would never go above them, but some are beneath them, but most people do comply with them. And what they offer is 67 square inches of cage space per bird. Now, if you're like me, Brandy, and you don't know what 67 square inches looks like, look, you and I, we're not mathletes, right? We don't know what 67 square inches is.
Not.
So take this piece of paper.
Okay.
This is 8.5 by 11, 93 square inches.
Okay.
This is 93 square inches, so you fold it back by about a third. And that's how much space each one of these 4-pound animals has on which to live for more than a year before she's slaughtered. It really is difficult to imagine a more miserable existence.
Exactly.
We're not talking about a few rotten eggs in the industry here. We're talking about standard industry practices that are simply rotten. Right. This is the amount of space that nearly all of the eggs that are laid in our country are coming from the birds who they're coming from have that much space.
Now, just from a logistical standpoint, I mean, this has to be a filthy, bacteria-ridden situation because and I own birds, they're parrots. They poop all the time. So I'm sure a chicken poops as much, if not more, as my parrots do. And if they were in a cage in that much space, pooping all day long, the filth would be inexplicable.
Yeah.
So what happens? So they put them in there, there's all this crap everywhere, and so they feed them a bunch of antibiotics. Is that how it works?
Well, first let me say that I have not reviewed the scientific literature on the rate of defecation between chickens and parrots, but I will do that after this interview to make sure that your claim is correct.
At least I know you're thorough.
But second, these factory farms that are producing eggs, you could have over 100,000 birds per shed, and they're stacked in these cages, oftentimes defecating into what's called a manure pit, which is a large pit beneath the birds where the manure stacks up and doesn't get cleaned out often, maybe once a year, maybe once every 18 months. So you have piles of manure that can be more than 6 feet tall and that go on, generally 1 or 2 football fields long.
Oh my gosh.
It's a repulsive situation. It is a perfect breeding ground for flies, for rodents. It's one of the reasons why the neighbors of these factory farms complain so much because of the overpowering stench of manure that can emanate throughout the neighborhood. It can destroy the quality of their lives. It can really cause major property loss when you look at what your home is worth. Let's say if you have a home in a nice neighborhood and a major egg factory sets up shop and all of a sudden you have ammonia surrounding in the air, your property value can go way down.
Absolutely.
So these factory farms are abusing animals. They're oftentimes degrading the environment. They're hated by their neighbors. It's a lose-lose all around.
Right. And that happened in California. I was reading a story about, totally happy people, egg factory moves in. And what we want to talk about too is all this dust.
Yeah.
The filthy dust is coming out of there and going into their homes when they have their windows open.
Yeah, a lot of the times the neighbors of these animal factories can't even have their windows open. They can't enjoy their yards. They don't want to go outside. They're embarrassed to even invite people over to their homes. It really damages their quality of life. Needless to say, the quality of life of the animals who are confined inside of them could hardly be worse. And so that's when we talk about animal abuse leading to problems for humans as well. This is a perfect example.
Yeah.
So often when we're cruel to animals, we're not doing ourselves any favors either. It's bad for them and it's bad for us.
Well, so with this in mind, we're talking about the laying hens. Help me then to decipher all of the lingo that's all over my egg carton, because we've got words from like all natural, and like you were saying before, we have like the picture of the barn, and all this nice little pastoral kinds of stuff. Help me decipher, because I know there's free range eggs, there's cage free eggs. Walk me through this.
Sure. There is a dizzying array of labels on egg cartons that relate to the welfare of animals, and this is because more and more consumers are interested in how farm animals are treated.
Well, that's a good thing, right?
We're certainly pleased to see that happening. More and more awareness is leading to more and more concern. The more Americans learn about how abused farm animals are, the more outrage there will be, and the greater change we'll see.
Exactly.
So, the egg industry, though, often has decided not to try to improve animal welfare, but only to keep people in the dark about how animals are treated with misleading claims on egg cartons. So, for example, you'll see terms like farm fresh, or you'll see all natural, when those came from birds who were locked inside of battery cages so small they couldn't spread their wings for their entire lives. Again, more than 9 out of 10 egg cartons that you see in the supermarket come from birds who were locked up to the point of near immobilization, and these claims are being put on their egg cartons.
Right.
The type of claims you're talking about, free range or cage free, are an improvement. You know,
Okay.
they're not nothing. But they're not the green bucolic pastures that you might envision if you think about free range.
Okay.
At least cage-free birds aren't in cages.
Right.
Cage-free means they're free from cages. Doesn't mean they go outside. They're still
Right.
generally indoors. They're in a barn. They can walk around. They can perch or lay their eggs on nests. But they're still pretty crowded in there, and they don't really go outside. So it's not that cage-free necessarily means cruelty-free, but it is the fact that it's an improvement. But it's still a very small percentage of the industry, less than 1 out of 10 egg cartons you see in the supermarket.
Okay, yeah, I didn't realize that it was that small. Well, and also what I understand is the law is set up, the wording of the law is set up to this, to say they have access to the outside. But what people
Right.
don't know is that access is actually a door about this big with a big fan in front of it that the chickens will never ever go to, of course, out of fear.
It could be. So that would be the case for free range and organic, not necessarily cage free, but free range and organic has this mandate that the birds have access to the outdoors. But there's no definition for how often the outdoor access has to be,
Okay.
how good it has to be, how many of them have to be able to go outside. So you could have a situation like what you're referring to, where they have access to the outdoors but they never go outdoors.
Right.
You could have somebody who doesn't even provide access to the outdoors for months out of the year, and then they do in some other months, and they say, well,
okay.
they have access later on. I mean, it's
Okay.
so vague that pretty much almost anything goes.
Right. So where do the laying hens go when they can't lay anymore?
Well, we keep laying hens around for about 18 months where we're tormenting them inside of these battery cages that can barely move an inch their entire lives. And then we send them to slaughter. And sometimes they will go to animal farms like mink farms for fur, where they go and they feed these caged mink the dead bodies of the chickens. Other times, though, more commonly, they're just rendered and put back into farm animal feed.
Okay.
And so most of them they have so little meat on them, as these birds are just so battered by the end of their laying cycle, that they can't really be used for human consumption many times because their bones are so fragile that when you slaughter them, their bones splinter and then you get that in the meat. So most often they're just rendered, fed back to other chickens, or they're fed to pigs or to cattle,
Okay.
or they're oftentimes put in pet food too.
Yeah, that's one of my questions for you down the road is where is our pet food coming from? But we'll get
Yeah.
to that later.
Yeah, it's a lot of animals who died before making it to the slaughter plant too.
Right. So tell me a little bit about a practice that used to be used called forced molting.
In the egg industry, until just a few years ago, most producers would purposefully starve their birds for up to 2 weeks in order to manipulate the laying cycle. Now, what they wanted to do was shut the birds' bodies down and cause them nearly to die. In fact, many of them do die during this process. And then start feeding them again after a couple weeks, which then shocks their body into a new laying cycle, and they lay even bigger eggs as well.
Okay.
This is a practice that's obviously cruel. It's obviously inhumane. If you were to do this to dogs or cats, you would be thrown in prison.
Right.
But because the victims are chickens, nobody was really thrown in prison for this, despite the fact that they subjected hundreds of millions of animals annually to this forced starvation. It's unbearable to think about it and to realize that the egg industry defended this inhumane practice for decades.
Up until you said just a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
But the good news is that it's not used anymore.
So what egg producers do now is that they largely still cause a molt, but what they do is they offer a very low calorie, very fibrous, bulky feed. It's been compared to, for example, eating nothing but popcorn. You couldn't live on it, but at least it should hopefully satiate some of your hunger pangs.
Okay.
But it's not ideal. But that's what I mean. First of all, birds molt. When you see birds in the wild, they molt too. The goal of the egg industry is to cause a uniform molt, so they all molt at the same exact time.
Okay.
That's why they do this.
I see. We're talking about hens all the time. What happens to the male side of this story?
In the egg industry, only female birds are needed because males won't lay eggs. And the males that the egg laying strains won't grow nearly as fast as the broiler chickens do, and so they're not economically viable to keep alive. So for every egg laying hen who's born, there is a male chick who's also born. And those animals are basically sent to their death on the first day of their life. When the chicks are sexed, they take the males, they put them on a separate conveyor belt, and the most common source of killing them is just to grind them alive. They throw them into what the industry calls a macerator, but it just grinds these chicks alive. Sometimes they're put in plastic bags to suffocate them, but most often they just grind these birds alive. Hundreds of millions of day-old chicks every single year welcomed to the world right when they hatch by throwing them into a grinder. That's how little concern for animals this industry has.
Well, and that's the thing that makes me kind of wary, is sort of like, yes, there are things that are becoming better. They're not doing the forced molting, they're not doing these things, but I have reservation to trust an organization that would do this sort of thing and use these kinds of practices, and the only reason they're ever stopped is because they're being forced to stop by people like the Humane Society and other organizations, that care of, animal welfare, and certain legislation that's brought about from that.
Look, nearly every animal welfare improvement in the agribusiness industry has come about because the industry was forced to change, either through legislation, through litigation, or through major buyers of theirs, the big fast food restaurants or big grocers who demand that their suppliers change their practices.
Now, so in a perfect world, we would have, if you wanted to be an egg eater, you could buy pastured eggs.
Yeah,
correct. So now what exactly does that mean?
When people think about pasture-based farming, they're talking about animals who are actually out on a pasture as opposed to just cage-free or free-range.
You mean the natural way that it always happened up until recently when they threw them into a factory?
Yes, so that's exactly right. It is pretty amazing to think that maybe something about how we used to do things was accurate. But here's the thing, the pasture-based egg market is minuscule. Probably,
and it's expensive.
Yeah, it's probably less than 1% of all eggs in the country, so 99% plus are not. But if you go to farmers markets and you're willing to pay, $5 or $7 or $8 per dozen, you can. And there are a lot of people who are willing to do that.
Yeah, I think the last ones I bought were like $3.99, so it wasn't terrible. But see, for me, I will not support the factory farmed egg situation because of what I know. And so that's what I'm trying to tell people, is once you know this situation, you have a choice. You can buy this or you can buy this. This might be less expensive, but there's a whole litany of things that goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah, the thing is we have to look at what we mean by cost, because the cost of the product is not fully represented at the cash register. When you go to the supermarket, you're paying like $3.99 or whatever, but there are other costs associated with these. The cost of animal cruelty that's borne on the animals' backs that they are paying. The cost of environmental degradation, which either taxpayers are paying to clean up or the neighbors themselves are paying. The cost of increased health care for the people who now have respiratory problems from living in that community. There are all these costs that don't get factored into what you pay at the supermarket that are externalized, that are just paid for by other people and not reflected in the cash register cost.
Okay. Now, what if I'm a person who says, you know what, I don't care about these chickens. I don't care that they're in these cages or whatever. Why should these people care about this issue from a human standpoint? Now, you mentioned, the people who live in the community. But, we're talking about antibiotics that need to be used to control the infection rates in these sorts of situations. I know that they're also they're on the cages. Their feet are on cage for their entire life. They don't actually lay on a flat surface. So this presents all kinds of problems. The cage cuts their feet, and sometimes their nails will wrap around the cage. You know, you need antibiotics to control all of this stuff. So where do the antibiotics come from, and how do they affect the chicken, which then affects the person?
First of all, the studies are very clear that cage egg operations tend to have far greater rates of salmonella infection than cage-free egg operations do, and free range oftentimes have even less. So there's a real connection there between salmonella and cage confinement of laying hens. In the broiler chicken industry, this is where the chickens who we raise for meat, these birds are routinely dosed with non-therapeutic antibiotics designed for the purpose of causing growth promotion and keeping them healthy in these very unsanitary environments where they're living in their waste. In fact, about 80% of all of the antibiotics that are produced and consumed in the United States are consumed by farm animals, not by humans. And this is causing a huge problem of antibiotic resistance. The problem is that when you overuse antibiotics, they become less and less effective because the germs develop resistance. So the American Medical Association has condemned this practice of routinely dosing our farm animal population with non-therapeutic antibiotics, and yet the pharmaceutical and agribusiness industries are so powerful that they keep this practice going, so much so that we're losing the efficacy of many of our most important human drugs, human antibiotics. And for what? So that we can raise farm animals in deplorably inhumane and unsanitary conditions?
Well, we want our eggs, we want our meat. Come on now, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the antibiotic usage is less rampant in the egg industry than in the meat industry, but either way, the point is that, you know, farm animals shouldn't be consuming 80% of the antibiotics that are being consumed in the United States. Human illness is far too serious of a matter to just throw away some of the most important tools that we have to combat these very strong bugs. The broader concern is that you're dosing these animals with antibiotics that then wind up in the manure, which then winds up in the waterways and then in the soil, and you develop stronger and stronger bugs because of these low dosages of antibiotics going throughout the environment. That's the real problem that we're talking about here.
So, right, so all that is ending up in the water.
Right. Anybody could have the problem. It's not necessarily just the chicken eater who could have the problem. It's like, for example, avian flu or swine flu. These are illnesses that pose very serious threats to humanity, and they're not coming about necessarily from somebody eating infected pork or eating infected chicken. It's because of the bad farming practices that we're putting society as a whole at great jeopardy. You could be a lifelong vegan and still get swine flu or get bird flu.
Because it's coming from an environmental place and not
That's
from
right.
a meat source place.
That's right.
Now, there is a chicken producer who claims in his advertisements that there are no hormones used and no antibiotics ever. And I have read on certain labels that it is against the law to use these things with certain animals. So how do they get around that?
There are a number of chicken producers who will label on their packages, no hormones used.
Exactly.
What they don't tell you is that it's illegal to give chickens hormones. It's not legal to do it. They'll give them antibiotics, but they won't give them hormones. Now, they do use hormones in the beef and the pork industries.
Okay.
But in the poultry industry, they don't use hormones because it's illegal. And it's a very misleading claim to say no hormones used because no hormones are permitted to be used by anybody. It's not like that differentiates them from any of their competitors. They still are using oftentimes arsenic in the feed of the chickens to help make the meat a little bit pinker and to help them grow faster in these unsanitary and inhumane conditions. But there's all types of horrible things that we feed farm animals. I mean, you know, I mean, for example, many of the cattle who die before they can reach the slaughter plant, we just go and render them and feed them to all the pigs and the chickens. I mean, these are, and then when those animals die, we'll render them back up and then feed them back to the cows. It's a repulsive cycle of feeding animals irresponsibly.
So let's talk about the feed of animals a little bit. So let's stick to the chickens right now. Okay, so this person also claims that there's vegetarian feed. What difference does that make, really?
Probably not much. In fact, chickens aren't vegetarians. They like to eat a lot of insects and worms.
Grubs and worms and stuff.
Right, and so a vegetarian diet is not necessarily what chickens want.
Well, especially if it's a genetically modified soy and corn-based diet, correct?
Yeah.
That's a whole other issue.
Yeah, nearly all of the feed that is given to farm animals, corn and soy, is GMO.
Now, I read something recently that in order to get more omega-3 into the eggs, which is a big selling point now, which is kind of ridiculous because there is some omega-3 in eggs, but it's not a super source of omega-3, that they are now going to feed chickens the blubber from the seals that they kill in Canada.
That's a new one. I've not heard
You
of that.
have not heard of
No,
this?
you stumped me on this one, Brandy.
What? I didn't think that was possible.
I haven't heard it. That's remarkable to me.
Okay. I
will
just
say,
read it last week.
Yeah, I will say that, you know, we can easily get omega-3 from plant-based sources.
Well,
whether
much
it's
better.
Flax seeds,
Right.
walnuts, and so on
Yeah.
offer very good sources of omega-3.
Exactly.
So the
Well, I'll
thought
look
that
into that.
the thought that we need to be slaughtering seals to feed them to chickens is
Right.
quite absurd.